Today we're going to be talking about communication, which is why I think it's appropriate that this video is sponsored by VoxLink, a new social media app designed to get players together, find games with each other, and locate playgroups in their local area that's currently on Kickstarter. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and the popular miniature gaming experience, commonly known around the world as Warhammer 40,000, has a lot of words in it. I know I'm breaking crazy new ground here. There's basically endless rules, there's unit names, there's esoteric abilities, and it's all tough enough for somebody just jumping into the game. But to make matters worse, we as the Warhammer 40k community have a tendency to just make up extra words to add on top of that. So I went through dozens of old forum posts, polled my community for suggestions, and went through old coverage that I've done to create what I think is a relatively definitive list of all of the weird made-up phrases and colloquialisms that we as a community use in regular discourse about our favorite game, Warhammer 40k. So let's dive in. Today I'm going to break it down for you dictionary style, and as always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40,000 content, remember to hit like on the video, subscribe on the channel. To all that YouTube stuff, you've heard it a billion times. I don't think I really have to go through it in that much detail, but I really appreciate it. If you're watching this video right now, you and I probably have something very important in common. We both spend way too much time on YouTube. We both like playing miniatures games. But there's one special secret ingredient that miniatures games need to be absolutely great: an opponent. But those can be hard to come by if you're playing in a new location, new to the community, or maybe just moved to a new area, which is why I'm happy to talk to you about VoxLink. VoxLink is a new community building app designed by tabletop gamers for tabletop gamers. This new app is live on Kickstarter as we speak and will allow you to post up that you're looking for a game and the type of game that you're looking to play, and allow others to find and message you based on proximity. You'll also be able to use it to find new play groups, register for organized play events, communicate with local players, and even get notified about new content from your favorite content creators. Really, it's a wholesale social media app designed explicitly for tabletop gamers of all varieties, including those playing miniature games like Warhammer 40k. At launch, the VoxLink app is going to be free, but you can join as a premium member. And if you jump on the Kickstarter today, you can get enormous discounts on your premium membership. Premium membership is going to unlock some special abilities like event publishing and bracketing, 5% off purchases with brands such as Magnet Baron, Baron of Dice, and Dicehead Games, exclusive content on the app, and a verified badge, as well as exclusive beta access to the app and all of its features. Getting established in any new community is always hard, and especially so for the tabletop gaming community, which is why we need a tool like VoxLink to link players together.
I see what you did there.
Now, I've split these into rough categories, mostly covering the arena of the game that they relate to. There's not a hard and fast rule here, it's just sort of my personal preference, and you can find them in the timestamp down below the video. And let's go ahead and dive right in. A pretty common phrase is meta or meta game. These are sometimes used interchangeably, but mostly used to describe the environment a game is played within. Specifically, and mostly in the case of Warhammer 40,000, the armies that you're likely to play against within that group. Although it's not a hard and fast rule, the metagame as a whole is typically referred to the entirety of the game and is often brought up in discussions about win rates or faction play rates. Meta, on the other hand, is oftentimes to describe someone's local community, the group in which they play most often. You'll hear people use the term my meta, for example, to describe the players in the immediate vicinity that they'll play against. In an event can have a meta composed of all of the people playing at that event. The term is used to describe the composition of armies and players within the meta or metagame being referenced, and constructing army lists and strategies around the metagame, either as a whole or the local meta that you're playing in, is pretty common. A rules lawyer is someone who takes pride in their knowledge of the rules and typically tries to use that rules knowledge to gain an advantage in the game. This one has a little bit of a negative connotation. Typically, it's used to refer to somebody who weaponizes vague rules or tries to use their opponent's ignorance of rules against them. Somebody who's a rules lawyer can also be someone who's whack or win at all costs. This refers to either a person or a strategy that favors winning over basically every other consideration, including the enjoyment of both their opponent and potentially the win at all costs player themselves. Usually someone who's win at all costs will play the most optimized variety of whatever faction they've chosen. Oftentimes they'll choose the faction based on power level, not any other consideration. And oftentimes they'll also rely on underhanded skullduggery to win game, including gotchas, a phrase that we'll cover a little bit later on, and potentially cheating or other underhanded play. Someone who's win at all costs can often also be, quote, that guy, end quote. This is mostly just referring to a player that no one wants to play against, whether they're an incredibly toxic power gamer or just someone who's a bit of a dickhead. A lot of communities will have a that guy player who the normal community doesn't really want to interface with. This is usually someone who's just a little bit toxic on the tabletop. A gotcha is a rule or a mechanic that's easy to forget about or misunderstand. It also often refers to a triggered ability or reactive stratagem that's sometimes difficult to remember, but easy to fall into the trap of. In Warhammer 40k, rules like heroic interventions are oftentimes referred to as gotchas, since all you need to do is accidentally put a model within 3 inches of an opponent's character to potentially trigger game-ending interactions. You'll find this most often used in reference to reactive mechanics or triggered mechanics that if you don't explain to your opponent beforehand and they don't have any other foreknowledge of, they could fall prey to. Moving on to format definitions, these often refer to the framework of a game that a game is played within or the style of game that is being played. A casual game, for example, is a game played outside of a competitive or tournament context. It doesn't necessarily have to be narrative or use any particularly non-competitive rules. It's just a game for which there is no prize for winning outside of maybe bragging rights. A narrative game, on the other hand, is a game or event played entirely with the storyline in mind. Players are encouraged to make tactical and battlefield decisions based on what would tell the greatest story and essentially role play within what their army would do. For events or game styles like this, army lists are also encouraged to have a basis in the background of Warhammer 40,000. So playing Salamander Space Marines who have an affinity for flame and melta weapons, but not bringing those flame and melta weapons, for example, would maybe not quite fit with the theme of the event. An RTT or Rogue Trader tournament is the smallest variety of competitive tournament that Warhammer 40k hosts. Rogue Trader refers to the first edition of Warhammer 40k, and I think at one point Games Workshop themselves hosted a series of tournaments called Rogue Trader tournaments, which just defined a small one-day event. Generally speaking, these are composed of 3-round tournaments where players will play 3 games over the course of a single day and have any number of players from as few as 4 to even larger events with 50 or 60 players. However, those larger events will oftentimes go to more than one undefeated, meaning that there isn't a single winner at the end of the tournament. Players will most likely be fighting for placement. In 9th edition Warhammer 40k, the phrase Grand Tournament has 2 separate definitions. Either it's the competitive format for Warhammer 40k that is distributed in Grand Tournament books. You can also refer to this as the Grand Tournament 40k format, which is basically the basis for all competitive 40k games. A Grand Tournament also refers to an event of larger than RTT size. These will usually have between 24 and 64 players and run over 5 rounds over the course of 2 days, oftentimes going to having a single undefeated. A major is the next level of competitive tournament. These will have 64 or more players and will oftentimes usually go 5 to 6 rounds over the course of 2 days. And a super major is the largest form of 40k tournament. These will usually be 200 plus players and oftentimes will go for 3 days. In 40k, the size of an event has some prestige to it. Obviously, there's more bragging rights for winning larger events, and the ITC, Independent Tournament Circuit, which is the global ranking system for Warhammer 40k, will weight tournaments of those larger sizes, like major and super major events, much more highly than the smaller RTT or grand tournaments. Now, these tournaments oftentimes are surrounded by an additional layer of rules over top of the core Warhammer 40k or Grand Tournament GT format rules. These are often referred to as meta mechanics. These are rules outside the game that can impact gameplay, but aren't necessarily part of the game itself. This is most often used in the context of things like timing or tournament pairing, where whether or not points are valued more highly than raw wins or your opponent's win rate can change how you value your decisions on the tabletop, but these aren't actually rules within the game itself. Now, when it comes to styles of events, you'll find a couple different terms being used. Singles events are where single players play one other single player, like a regular game of 40k, a good old 1v1. Doubles events are where 2 players together command a single army, usually composed of 2 separate lists or 2 separate detachments, and each player is given control of them, and they fight another team of 2 players. Whereas a team event typically refers to an event where a team of players face off against another team. These teams usually go through some sort of pairing process to pair each player from the team with a player from the opposing team, such as the World Team Championship or WTC format. This makes the pairing process an important part of the team tournament strategy, and while it just comes down to the results of 1-versus-1 singles games, the final winner of the round is the team that performs best in the aggregate of those games, so individual results matter less. Now, dice rolling is a big thing in Warhammer 40k, and there are a lot of mechanics that surround dice rolls, so we're going to talk about some dice rolls. Next up, exploding dice is a pretty important one. Oftentimes this refers to hits or wounds, so you hear somebody use the term exploding hits or exploding wounds, and these are effects that count certain dice rolls as extra successes, usually dice rolls of 6. So you'll see a mechanic say like a hit roll of 6 counts as 2 hits instead of 1. This is expanded into Tesla-ing dice, or double exploding dice. This is basically the same thing as exploding dice, but the effect counts as 2 additional successes for a total of 3, rather than just double the normal result. This is because Necron Tesla weapons are kind of the poster child for this mechanic, where it was originally introduced, where hit rolls of 6 with a Tesla weapon chain off to additional members of the unit and count as 3 hits instead of just 1. Space Marines have a lot of aura abilities that provide rerolls, which means Space Marine units lend their name to a lot of reroll effects. A Captain aura is usually an aura that allows units within it to reroll their ones to hit. A Lieutenant aura is a similar thing, an aura ability that allows you to reroll your ones to wound. Just to elucidate things, that means every time an attack is rolled, if you roll a hit or wound roll of a 1, depending on the type of aura you're being affected by, you're going to be able to pick that dice up and roll it again. Now, these are contrasted with full rerolls, which allows you to reroll any of the dice that are available to you rather than just ones like the Captain or Lieutenant auras would get you. This is used sometimes interchangeably, where either you'll say full hit rerolls or full wound rerolls or full rerolls, which implies that you would get to reroll both the hit and the wound roll. One way that you can get these full rerolls is from a Chapter Master. This is another reference to a Space Marine ability that allows a single unit or units in an area to reroll all of their hit rolls. A lot of factions have an equivalent to a Chapter Master, like for example the Swarmlord for Tyranids, and oftentimes you'll just describe Swarmlord as a Chapter Master effect, rather than saying that he allows a unit within Synaptic Link range to reroll all of its hit rolls. A floating reroll, or a Master Artisans style reroll, is a reroll that you can only use once per activation. In Warhammer 40k, your combat activations are split up from unit to unit, which reminds me, I should probably put that in this document. I do talk about that a little bit in my How to Play Warhammer 40k video, so you can go check that out. A floating reroll is a reroll usable on a single die per each one of those activations. So your unit could be rolling 10 attacks. Out of those 10 dice that you'd roll to hit, you can reroll one of them, regardless of the result of that die. A Master Artisans style reroll specifically comes from Space Marines again, because they have a subfaction trait named Master Artisans that grants you a hit reroll, so that is specifically on the hit roll. A generically floating reroll is often referred to as a Tau Sept reroll, because the Tau Sept subfaction in the Tau Empire faction gets access to this ability. It allows you to reroll a hit roll or a wound roll. Once you've gotten through all of those rolls and re-rolls, you will get to a converted roll. This just means a successful roll. So for example, if you roll 10 dice to hit, 6 of them score successful hits, you have converted 6 of your hit re-rolls. You have converted 6 of your hit rolls. A converted attack is when an attack goes through the whole sequence and successfully deals damage to your opponent. So it's gone through the hit roll, wound roll, saving throw, and then inflicts damage successfully. Okay, that's a lot of dice. Let's talk about something a little bit easier. Let's go to army lists. A super faction is a collection of factions that can ally. Super factions are usually codified by their faction keyword, which are keywords that cannot be used to form detachments. These are things like Imperium, Tyranids, or Chaos that your army can share, but a single detachment cannot be constructed from. A faction is a little bit more granular. Units are unified by a faction keyword that can be brought in a detachment together. For example, something like Space Marines. These typically refer to a single codex full of units, but sometimes you'll find codexes that are able to be used in multiple factions, or factions that are composed of multiple codexes. A sub-faction is a division of a faction that has unique abilities separate from all the other sub-factions. The most common example of this is a Space Marine chapter, and oftentimes you'll find these referred to as chapters as well. MSU stands for either multiple small units or minimum-sized units. This is a list archetype that basically does what it says on the tin. It uses a bunch of units that are very small in size, oftentimes because they can overwhelm their opponent's ability to kill them, or each individually can hit greater than its weight class. This is basically the opposite of a Death Star, which refers to either an army constructed around a big centerpiece unit or the big centerpiece unit themselves. This can be a big, huge brick of Terminators or heavy infantry or even super heavy vehicles with an army just constructed to support it. Basically, as long as your list is very top-heavy, focused around a single unit or combination of units, then it is a Death Star. Death Star units themselves can often be referred to as bricks. These are typically large, expensive units at the maximum size that they can be taken. For example, 10 Space Marine Terminators with all their upgrades. This originates from Warhammer Fantasy, which was a square-based game where your large units ranked up together in rectangular formations that looked like bricks. These are different from Death Stars, however, in the fact that they aren't necessarily the central focus of your army. Death Star lists can oftentimes be gatekeeper lists, which are defined as a strong list or list archetype that has bad enough matchups that make it difficult for it to win consistently, but players will usually need to beat it in order to win an event. Literally, it's keeping the gate of top placement in that event. The most common example of this is a faction like Imperial Knights that brings all super tough to kill vehicles that, while the faction is strong and has very good mechanics, because they're focused entirely on vehicles, oftentimes have very bad matchups to them and make it difficult to win events consistently using Imperial Knights. But every army is going to have a plan to deal with Imperial Knights if they ever want to consistently win a tournament themselves. Gatekeeper lists are also often SKU lists or stat check lists. These are defined as lists that focus on a specific defensive profile, either light infantry with invulnerable saves, for example, or super high toughness units, with the hopes that an enemy army won't have brought the correct tools to be able to deal with that. You've skewed so hard in one direction that armies with a more balanced range of attacks won't be able to punch through that defensive stat line with all of their attacks and will consequently do smaller proportion of their total expected damage. A Hero Hammer list is a list focused around getting value out of characters or customized small units. These lists will often spend a lot of resources on pre-game abilities and purchasing relics and warlord traits and custom abilities for specific characters in order to drive their damage output up and get most of their damage from the list out of those characters. Oftentimes these characters will be smash characters, which are just characters that are designed to beat face. They don't have much of a support effect. They are just built to deal as much damage as transhumanly possible. The classic example of a Smash character is a Smash Captain, which is a Space Marine captain kitted out with relics and warlord traits to deal the most damage possible in melee. But oftentimes you'll find Smash character builds out of most factions in the game. And that moves us on to, I think, what might be the biggest category in this video: mechanics. Special names or legacy names given to specific rules in 40k that we see pretty often. I just put it in my notes here, but activation. Just about every time a unit is called upon to do something in a phase in Warhammer 40k, that unit performs all of its actions for that phase independently, and then you move on to the next unit. Each one of these unit actions is called an activation. You will activate one of your units, shoot with them in the shooting phase, then move on once they're done to activate another unit. One of the most common ones in any list like this is Feel No Pain, also called a shrug or damage ignore roll. These are any abilities that allow you to ignore damage taken on a unit on a roll of some number plus. For example, when a unit suffers damage, roll a d6 on a 5+, that wound is not lost, is a good example of a Feel No Pain style ability. I like damage ignore or damage prevention roll. Feel No Pain is a legacy name for this mechanic from back in maybe 3rd or 4th edition, and doesn't really mean anything, but I think damage prevention or damage ignore really meshes with the mechanics pretty well. This is different from damage reduction, which are effects that lessen the amount of damage of attacks targeting that unit. These can also be called Duty Eternal, because that is the ability that Dreadnoughts have that grants them damage reduction. Feel No Pain or damage prevention style abilities are usually baked into the save characteristics. I've written down in my notes here +/+/++++, which is basically how they're written out in the common parlance online. Save characteristics in Warhammer 40k are listed as a number with a plus sign, meaning you have to roll that number or higher in order to successfully save. Invulnerable saves work the same way, but are not listed on a unit's stat line. But when people are talking about a unit's defensive profile, oftentimes they'll ship in invulnerable saves alongside that save characteristic. Invulnerable saves will get 2 pluses at the end and damage ignore rolls or damage prevention saves will get 3 pluses at the end. So a unit with a 2+ armor save, 5+ invulnerable save, and 6+ damage ignore roll will be referred to as a 2+, 5+, 6+++. It sounds very silly to say it out loud, but generally speaking, you're going to be reading it in a Discord thread or something, and it flows a lot better, I swear. Invuln is short for invulnerable saves. That one feels pretty self-explanatory. It's just invulnerable, but shorter. Transhuman, or a transhuman effect, it means that a unit can only be wounded on a roll of a 4+, irrespective of other abilities that the target may have. This is called this way because of the transhuman physiology stratagem in Space Marines, where this mechanic originally comes from. A stalwart effect, or mini transhuman, means that the unit can only be wounded on a roll of 3+. It's a slightly less effective version of Transhuman. It's called Stalwart because it's the name of a Space Marine subfaction ability that this effect originally came from. You'll find that a lot of these are from Space Marines, by the way, because Space Marines tend to be the most fleshed out faction, and because they're oftentimes released early in an edition, they'll be the first place that a lot of these mechanics end up coming from. This comes from the Gene Rot Might stratagem in Codex Space Marines. It means that your rolls of 6 to hit automatically wound the target of the attack. A Flamer is a weapon that's typically short range and automatically hits. This is because this is the role given to all of the Flamer and Flame weapons in the game. Rending is an ability that improves the armor penetration characteristic of the attack on a wound roll of 6. This comes from old styles of abilities that used to entirely bypass saving throws on wound rolls of 6. That effect has mostly been replaced by just improving AP values. These are things like shuriken weapons from Eldar who have additional AP on 6s. A Deep Strike is an ability to come on as a reinforcement outside 9 inches of enemies. This is different from Strategic Reserves, which is the reserve mechanic in the core rulebook, because those specifically come off table edges. But a Deep Strike effect allows you to come in anywhere on the table outside that 9-inch area. That 9-inch area is often called a denial area or a Deep Strike denial range. And these will often affect units like drop pods, which is a term to refer to any unit that can use a Deep Strike effect on turn 1 regardless of mission rules. Usually you cannot come out of reinforcements on turn 1 because that's what the rulebook says, but there are some units like drop pods or tyrannocytes that ignore this restriction. When a unit comes out of Deep Strike or piles out of its drop pod, you can often auspex scan them. This is also referred to as intercepting them and is an ability that allows you to make attacks targeting units being set up as reinforcement. This is because it's a Space Marine stratagem, but also affects stratagems and other abilities like Forewarned in the Eldari Codex, which does basically the same thing. A wound cap or phase cap is a rule that puts a restriction on the amount of damage a unit can take in a phase. This originally comes from Catan shards from the Necron Codex, who can only lose 3 wounds per phase. These will usually say that wounds taken in excess of that wound cap or phase cap are not lost, meaning that it takes a certain number of phases to remove. A jump shoot jump or fire and fade is an ability that allows models to move after shooting. Jump shoot jump is referring to the old jetpack rule that units like Crisis battlesuits had that allowed them to move in the charge phase to get back out of line of sight after shooting at someone, and fire and fade refers to the Eldari stratagem. Hit and run or overrun are abilities that allow models to move after fighting in melee. Pretty similar to the jump shoot jump, but it just happens in the fight phase instead of the shooting phase. A scout or forward deployment rule is a rule that lets a unit start the game outside their deployment zone, such as concealed positions in the Space Marine Codex. I guess this is the one example of a Space Marine rule that didn't really turn into a common phrase. A pre-game move is kind of self-explanatory. It's any rule that allows units to move before the game, usually at the start of the first battle round. Oftentimes you'll find units with these abilities lumped together and referred to as forward operators or advanced units that will start the first turn outside of your deployment zone. That moves us on to redeploy, which is a bit of a can of worms. This one can mean 2 things. If referred to at the start of the game, it's an effect that lets you reposition units as if you were deploying them again, also referred to as Phantasm, because that's an Eldari stratagem that allows you to do that. During the game, it's usually used to refer to an effect that lets a unit that's already on the battlefield deep strike again, so you pick them up and then put them down in the same turn. These can also be called reposition or re-deep strike effects. Impact hits or impact attacks are effects that deal damage or mortal wounds when you complete a charge. And speaking of mortal wounds, mortals is a shortening of the term for those. So if you take 3 or 4 mortals, you are being assigned that many mortal wounds. Fight phase or combat movement This refers to heroic interventions, pile in, and consolidate moves that are performed in and around the fight phase. Almost all of these typically move a model 3 inches and require it to end closer to the closest enemy. We'll talk a lot more about this as we move on to the tactics section of the video. Character protection just means having a character be untargetable thanks to the look out sir rule. For example, because this model is within 3 inches of a unit giving looks out sir, he's being character protected by the units in front of him. Sniper weapons are weapons that can target characters regardless of lookout sir. However, this is different from the sniper rule, which is usually an ability that deals mortal wounds on a specific dice roll to wound. This is because this was the original rule given to sniper rifles, I think supposed to represent kind of headshot effect where you get a critical hit on the target. But now a lot of melee weapons and other abilities have that. A lot of times in missions, you'll hear players refer to Dawn of War, Hammer and Anvil, corner, or diagonal deployments. A lot of these refer to old deployment setups where the deployment style was actually defined in the codex by a specific. Dawn of War refers to setups where your deployment zone is along the long table edge of the battlefield. Hammer and Anvil refers to a setup where the deployment zone is along the short table edge of the battlefield. Corner is where you're in the corner, often separated by an 18-inch circle in the middle of the battlefield, and diagonal means that your deployment zone is diagonal along the midline of the battlefield. So you'll oftentimes set up from one corner of the battlefield to the center line. Bottom round 5 scoring is the rule in many missions, especially in the GT packet, where the second player, the player who did not take the first turn, has a benefit to score at the end of the game. Oftentimes you'll find people referring to the fact that they have bottom round 5 scoring, so they'll be able to get a little bit of a bump at the end of the game. And that moves us on to tactics. These are not specifically mechanics in 40k, but you'll find people often refer to them when they're doing specific game actions. For example, a combat orbit is making a combat movement, like we talked about earlier, such that the model moves as far as it can along the battlefield, but only ends the movement incrementally closer to the closest model. So for example, if you start 1 inch away from the closest model, you will move 3 inches around them in kind of an orbit fashion and end 0.9 inches away from them. That gives you the maximum amount of movement that you can possibly have from a combat movement, but technically fulfills all the requirement of a combat movement, which is that it ends closer to the closest model at the start of the movement. Combat bouncing often uses combat orbits, and this is the use of pile-in and consolidate moves to orbit around a model such that you move in and or out of another model's engagement range to prevent it from fighting back. I have a lot of videos, especially in my Advanced Tactics series, talking specifically about how to do all this stuff, but once you see it on the table, it makes total sense. Tri-pointing is putting 3 models in base contact on opposite sides of a model's base to prevent it from moving away using a fallback, requiring it to use the desperate breakout stratagem if it wants to leave. Basing or being based is moving or having a unit in base contact with you, such that the bases of the 2 models touch, usually done to prevent combat movement in melee, since you usually can't use pile-in or consolidate moves if you are based or in base contact with an enemy. Screening or area denial is placing models on the table specifically to prevent reinforcements. You can have your screens out in front of your army so that their 9-inch area denial area stops units from coming in out of deep strike or out of reinforcements in areas where they can access the heart of your army and your most important units. Wall screening or wall blocking is placing models near building walls so that enemies can't complete charges without going around. Since even though a lot of walls are breachable and many unit types are able to move through them, you can't physically put your model inside of a wall, so if you make it impossible for your opponent to complete that charge because of the spacing of the wall with your model, you can force them just to go around the edge of your unit. Move blocking is placing your models such that enemy models can't move through them without charging, thus restricting their ability to get up the table. Body blocking is placing your models in close formations such that your opponent can't end moves or charges because of your base or engagement range. For example, if you've surrounded a unit such that enemies can't charge it because they can't end in its engagement range, then you have body blocked that unit off. Slingshotting is a way to weaponize these body blocking or move blocking strategies, usually using charge moves or combat movement to reposition a unit and get extra movement up the table without actually caring about the damage that it does. Because you still get pile-in and consolidate moves after you've charged as long as the charge is successful. In addition to the charge movement, you can use this to springboard units around the table or reposition them around the table. An alpha strike is an attack or aggressive play that deals a lot of damage to your opponent first before they're able to do damage to you so that their army is crippled and they can't fight back. This is the opposite of a beta strike. That is a strategy that revolves around dealing a lot of damage to aggressive enemies after they've already hit you. So you absorb the original hit and then hit them back even harder. A peace trade is a style of strategy or a style of game where you are using units to kill important enemy units with the assumption that they'll be killed on the follow-up. This is straight out of chess. You're going to be trading your offensive units for your opponent's most important support units, for example, that are oftentimes worth more than them. Even though they're going to be taking your unit back, you'll be up on value in that trade. Ooh, we're down to the last category here. These are some random miscellaneous terms that I couldn't really find to put anywhere else, so they're here now. Scornergy. This is from War Machine and Hordes, and basically means anti-synergy, especially any two abilities that feel like they should work together, but actually don't. For example, an ability that would be really good to buff your Overwatch, but only works during the shooting phase. Whereas Overwatch happens in the charge phase, those abilities would be scornergistic. This refers to a War Machine faction that had a lot of abilities that kind of weirdly didn't work together. A distraction Carnifex. This one gets used a lot and honestly is kind of nebulous. I got a lot of different responses from people and I asked them what they thought it meant. I think mostly it refers to a really big, scary looking model or unit that can tank a lot of damage and is imposing enough to distract an opponent from focusing on their actual important units. Essentially, it's just a unit that looks much scarier than it is and that draws your fire from the rest of your army. Next up, we have a super solo, a character or single model that can operate without the support of other units. This often refers to smash characters or characters that can kind of go and do their own thing and don't need to be character protected or babysat by other units to protect them. A Vindicare Assassin, I think, is a good example of this. He's just a guy who sits in the corner and shoots all game. A lot of times your opponent doesn't have a good way to deal with him, and he can just kind of be a lone wolf. A base trade is a situation or game state that often happens where players will effectively trade their deployment zones, one player moving aggressively to the other player's deployment zone, and the other player turning around and moving to their opponents. This comes from RTSs or real-time strategy games where sometimes both players will go on an aggressive attack and it will be a race to see who destroys the other player first. Teching or technology refers to specific combinations or upgrades in a list that's used for a specific purpose, oftentimes beating a specific matchup. Teching a list or bringing specific technology in the list are units or combinations that you have brought specifically to defeat types of enemies or specific enemy armies. It basically refers to inclusions that serve to optimize your list in a particular situation. And with that, oh my gosh, we did all of them. We did all the words. Let me know down in the comment section if you have any specific colloquialisms or verbiage that you use in your local game group that you thought I missed. I think it'd be cool if we could make this comment section kind of a dictionary of all of these esoteric terms that the Warhammer 40k community tends to use. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of this video. Thanks as well to VoxLink for supporting the video. Go check them out on Kickstarter at the links down below in the video description and pinned comment. And thanks to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.